For this miniature, I've pre-built the base using a 6-inch acrylic disc from Liquitex, which I scuffed with sandpaper to allow adhesive and paints to stick. The 3 dots are neodymium magnets that I glued into the base for future storage. I add large rocks and texture paste before pressing small rocks into the still wet pastes. Once fully dry, I hit it with black primer and some white ink. This is followed by a black wash and a dry brush of grays before setting it aside. This miniature was actually started this time last year and was originally airbrushed in the same colors that I used for the female wraith and grave wraith that I painted on this channel. You can find the links to those videos in the description and the latest one in the top right corner of your screen now. I didn't like the massive gaps between the segments of the body, and I tried Vallejo's plastic putty for the first time to fill them. This took about 30 minutes to dry to where it was sandable. I then took it back to the airbrush booth and hit it with a spray of violet from below and white from above. Doing this will leave some of the original blue visible, but not much. I already knew I wanted to paint this demoness like a Drider from Dungeons & Dragons Menzoberranzan. I searched for a Drowish reference that I liked and built a palette using Photoshop's eyedropper and brush tools. From here, I work with Army Painter Speedpaints to apply tints. To be upfront, I don't stick religiously to the sample palette I pulled with Photoshop, but it gives me the rough colors that I'll work around. Red for the eyes, white for the hair, and bluish skin tone. The biggest change is that I use a good amount of purples and just a little green. A lot of these colors will begin to overlap each other, especially on the legs, thorax, and abdomen, to create some patterns. An important note is to either overlap these colors immediately while they're still wet or to let them fully dry before adding the next. Army Painter Speed Paints are thin, and if they're partially dry, you can actually tear it away with just a pass of the brush. I thin some matte black paint to a glaze using Vallejo's glaze medium and add shadows to the tips of the legs and around the body. I also apply this as a kind of recess shading around the base of the spines. I do this over several applications due to the transparency of the glaze. Thinning down a few more speed paints, I apply stripes and small splotches to create more defined yet subtle patterns for the spider body. I didn't use a reference and just added whatever I felt like. However, I tried to keep whatever pattern I added symmetrical. I decided here to glue the miniature to the base, as I was beginning to worry that my fingers would start tearing up the thin layers that I've painted. It's not that Army Painter Speed Paints are super fragile, but I live on a farm and my hands are rougher than some of the sandpaper I use. The first layer highlight I add only to the knees and as dots on some of the leg segments, as well as the thorax and abdomen. The second layer highlight is thinned to a glaze and used to better blend some of the speed paints together, as well as add some shadows under the legs. The third highlight is a continuation of blending these colors, but this one focusing more towards the upper and brighter areas. The final highlight I add as an edge highlight around the body. Before I started highlighting the spider body, I was already 3 hours into this project. By the time I finished highlighting the spider body, it brought the total time up to 5 hours. The final speed paint I'll use in this project is added to the spines all around the body. Once fully dry, I come back with an edge highlight in the shape of a 3-point star to give them the rough appearance of a scalene triangle. I apply one final edge highlight to these spines with a brighter color, but cover significantly less area. I begin work on the hair next, first adding some shadows. I'm not too worried about making this super clean right now, as some of the highlight work will clean this up quickly. The most important thing I'm worried about is ensuring all of the recesses are covered equally and that no white or blue remains visible. Mixing together a light gray, I ended up base coating nearly all of the remaining hair, leaving the shadows, so the speed paint I added to the hair before wasn't really needed. With the light sky blue, I begin adding the first major highlight for the hair, catching edges and building up what will be the reflection against its sheen. I repeat the same step a second time, but covering slightly less space. Because the paint I'm using is thin, this helps give a slightly smoother transition while reinforcing the brighter areas. From here, I go back and forth with a few of the previously used colors, but thin down to a glaze to help add some shadows and brighten the highlights until I'm happy with it. I add the final highlight to the hair as pure white in the brightest parts of the sheen. I try to keep this pure white usage to a minimum, using it more of an edge highlight when there isn't a physical edge to even apply it to. Normally for the eyes, I black out the sockets, add a white sclera, and then add a centered black line. However, since the eyes on this miniature are so large, I want to try to actually add more details. After blacking out the sockets, I mix a faded light red for the sclera. I then paint in a citral dot with pure red as I want her to have a red pupil. One important tip that I learned is to let each application of paint for the eyes to fully dry before you add the next. This way, if you make a mistake, you can quickly remove the fresh paint with the damp brush without removing or damaging your previous work on the eyes. Here I had to pull out a brand new Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 1 brush as I needed a super fine tip to dot in the black center of the pupil. This also showed me how worn the current brush I'm using is. This step was nerve-wracking and I had to redo it several times. I didn't stop here though. I took it just a little further by adding an even smaller white dot slightly off center, covering both part of the black center and the red pupil to act as a reflection of light. This was even more anxiety inducing than the previous step, but somehow I managed to Forrest Gump my way through it in much less time. The funny part of watching this back is that I know all those baby strokes I'm making, I'm not even touching the model yet. The moment I touch the model once, the paint is on. After 30 minutes dedicated to just the eyes, I'm now at 7.5 hours of work on this miniature and I still have a long way to go. Pressing on, I move on to the flesh of the upper torso, adding in shadows with the dark purple to build definition to her curves and abdominal muscles. I add this shadow under her arms and cheeks and frame her face around the hairline, as well as add shadows under her brow. I mix a light gray before gently tinting this with blue and thin it to a glaze to begin adding highlights all over the body. Pretty much all of the highlights and shadows on the flesh will be glazes, and this is a very slow and tedious process as I ensure to allow each highlight to dry before adding the next. I add this same highlight again, but this time covering slightly less area, to gradually build transitions. I reglaze some of the shadows, covering just a little of the area that I highlighted previously to help further improve the transition between them. I add a brighter highlight now, this one covering a much smaller area. Using the first flesh highlight glaze, I add this between the brightest highlighted and the shadow areas, aiming to continually smooth the transition between them. As a final tool to help blend these colors together as well as add more saturation, I pull out a transparent blue ink. Despite the transparency, it's still incredibly saturated, so I thin it down with water and gradually build it up. I then add this over the brighter parts of the body and even to tint the shadows of the hair a little. I then add it a second time, though a little more selectively and only to the body. For the parts that will be metal, I decided to use metallic paints instead of trying to do non-metallic as I originally intended, with the main reasoning being the surface area is so small. Metallic paints would just be easier here. But first, I base coat all of these with black. I then add a stippling application of a dark silver, leaving a little of the black to act as shadows for the fine chain. I add an additional stippling highlight of a brighter silver, but this one covering maybe 50% of the parts that would receive the most light. These small chains took a very long time as I was careful to avoid errant brushstrokes on the wrong parts of the miniature. For the gold sections, I base coated these with a darker color, and because there were so few areas that will be gold, this went by much faster than the silver. With the brighter gold, I add a highlight to about 40% of the upper areas. With an even brighter gold still, I add a highlight to about 20% of the upper areas. I finish the gold parts by mixing together a dark purple and tint the lower parts of the sections to add a more interesting shadow. I paint the gems with the base coat of red and add a dark tint to the top 25% of them following the curve of the gem. I then add a white dot at the top for a reflection of light and then a glaze of white at the bottom, again following the curve of the gem to represent the light passing through the jewel. The fingernails, lips, and nipples were all base coated black. I then added a quick white reflection on the nails before adding the first highlights to the lips and nipples. These I continue building highlights on, adding increasingly brighter colors while covering less area with each highlight, as well as following the contours of the shapes. As a cleanup of any glossy surfaces, particularly in the hair and around the tips of the spider legs where the super glue is dried, I add a quick pass of Army Painter's anti-shine matte varnish before blacking out the rim and calling it a night. This is where I stopped. Compared to the last several miniatures I painted, this one definitely has a lot more effort into it, and though I used quite a few speed paints on the miniature, I also added a lot of layer highlights and glazes. I like how well the gems came out considering I have never painted gems in this manner before. I can definitely do better on future ones now that I have a decent idea of how they can be painted. For lessons learned, there are some really horrendous mold lines on this miniature, particularly on the hands, hair, and abdomen. I managed to cover the ones on the arms by painting them as if they were additional chains, and some of the ones on the hair by painting them as errant strands. However, some of these are uncoverable and needs to be fixed. I have some small hematite black chain that I'm thinking about gluing around the abdomen to cover the worst mold line, and then drape it over her right hand and into her left hand as if she's holding it while pointing. But I think I'll need to pick up some thicker gel super glue in order to do that, as I'm not sure how well metal would adhere to this plastic. My edge highlighting could have been finer, particularly around the joints on the spider legs, and there were some transitions of highlights on her face, specifically her cheeks, that could use some better blending with glazes. My final gripe will be the base. Though I like the rubble on it, its plain grayscale compared to all the colors on her make it seem too plain. All in all, I'm still happy with this miniature. And that'll bring this video to its end. I hope you learned something or inspired to start or expand your own collections of denizens from the Underdark. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and if you like the content of this video and would like to see more, support this channel by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Jim with Working with Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Until the next video.